Thank you, Jerry. This one's for me. This one's a demo for later, but if I run out of this one, I might go this one. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. If you can't at any point, let me know. I'll try to accommodate. Also, try to keep me from going to that side of the room because I've been warned if I go to that side, I will fall through a trap door from whence I can't get out. So I tend to walk around. I'm going to try not to be doing that too much because I watch myself sometimes videotape and I get dizzy. So I'll just warn you in advance. So I am very interested in aging research for a number of reasons I'll talk about today. I came here about 4.5 years ago. I did my postdoctoral research at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging out on the West Coast, just north of the San Francisco in the Bay Area. I have been interested in it for quite a while, and one of the reasons I got interested in it was because I realized there was actually something we could do. I mean, we've always been told, grown up, thinking that there was nothing you could do about this process. It was inevitable, unchangeable, and it's not entirely true. And the cool thing is this isn't based on really any man-made technology. All we're doing is tapping into what nature has perfected over millions and millions of years of evolution. And thank God there are programs to within our genes to affect this, because it really has some major implications. And I think benefiting from some of the technologies that are coming down is going to happen a lot sooner than probably anybody thinks. So, just a brief overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the classical approach to health and aging, which essentially has been to treat age-related diseases as they arise. Also, a little bit about the argument nature versus nurture. We've all heard this in different contexts. This is going to be specifically with regard to the influence on the rate of our own aging. And another way to say nature versus nurture is genetics versus the environment. Then we'll talk about the plasticity of aging, which is the favorite thing for me to talk about. And how we can sort of leverage these recurring themes in nature. The great thing about nature is it doesn't waste anything, that works. So we can actually tap into these very cool things that nature has already worked out for us. Give me an anti-aging drug, please. This is more my own point of view. I think I'm ready to take getting ready to take the plunge here and actually do something that goes beyond the normal stuff we associate with diet and exercise. And then we'll do a little more speculation on what the future holds and some of the alternatives to the purely biological context and approach to aging. So how is aging treated medically? As I said, for the most part, we treat diseases as they arise. Things like cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, neurological disease, immune dysfunction, muscle wasting. All of us in this room know somebody, if not ourselves, that's affected by one or more of just these things, not to mention a whole list of others. And the thing that's problematic, well, the good thing is, for some of these things we have treatments. The problem is we don't have treatments for everything, and we can't use oftentimes the same treatment that we have, say, for cancer as we do for type 2 diabetes or for neurological disease. And I think for a lot that kind of makes sense in some ways. Well, these things are very different. The one thing that all these things have in common, though, is aging. You know, we're all aging, and actually, the reason we get these diseases really is because we age. And it might seem like something stochastic, something, it's just entropy. It's just going toward a more disordered level. Once life starts, it's all about going downhill, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's not exactly true. And there are reasons that that happens in nature. And a big part of the reason is because, well, nature really doesn't care. Once you've sort of performed your function, which is to create and raise the next generation, nature really hasn't done anything to help too much to preserve us past that point. We actually have a remarkable long post-reproductive existence. The one thing, though, that has been true for a long time, and it's always, in our brains, it's always been sort of a common sense theme, which is, well, you know, your lifestyle is going to affect. And we might have seen somebody and say, oh, they must have lived a hard life because they're 40 and they look like they're 70, or you know, wow, they must really be doing something right because they're 50 and they look 30. How much of that is lifestyle, and how much of that is actually based on some kind of genetic predisposition for health? Just kind of, I just want to gauge, show of hands, who thinks genetics is more important than lifestyle? Show of hands. It looks like about 50% now. It might be actually more than that. I know sometimes people are shy to raise their hands, or maybe you just haven't had enough time to think about it. I mean, the truth, of course, is that there's got to be some kind of interaction, right? I mean, common sense would dictate that we know some people are more prone to certain diseases related to aging because of they have some gene allele, and it's associated with some form of cancer, or it's associated with maybe a type of neurodegeneration. So we definitely know there are things that can sort of accelerate the process or make us less likely to be healthy in an age-related context. But what about the other way around? Are there tricks? Are there little gene changes that actually would protect us from cancer, from neurodegeneration? Yes, there are. I'm just going to shorthand that here. The evidence for model systems definitely demonstrates that. There's now a lot more evidence in humans just from genome sequencing, and then sequencing your genes and then looking at how healthy different groups of people are, relating that information back to what we see in our experimental animal models. There's a lot of evidence that, yep, there are genes that can actually protect us, and certain kinds of gene activity that will protect us, not just give us disease, but actually protect us. So, what influences aging? Again, lifestyle versus genetics. This is Winifred Langley. Honestly, I don't know if she is still with us. This picture was taken quite a number of years ago now. So it would be really remarkable, but I think it demonstrates this point, right? You know, lifestyle versus genetics. Can somebody who is doing things that aren't exactly in line with a typically healthy lifestyle, can they somehow get around, sort of bypass what most of us would be able to get away with? Certainly, there's a lot of evidence behind the healthy lifestyle hypothesis. And as we're going to see, the great thing about it is it's not just that you're slowing down this entropy, this us approaching some state of randomness that is not conducive to a living organism. There's a number of programs that work. And what a lot of people, I think, don't realize, we think that lifestyle is somehow separate from genetics. Could not be more wrong. You don't have one without the other. Okay? There was an environment, and for life to have come into that environment, the genes had to be set up in such a way as they took into account that environment. And if we think about what else is required, well, if you think about the first forms of life out there, they had to be able to replicate themselves. And then they had maybe an advantage, or as evolution proceeded and moved things into specific niches, they had to be able to adapt. And I mean not just evolve, adapt, but within your lifetime or that organism's lifetime has to be able to adapt to changing conditions. And that requires your genes, and that is dependent on your genes. So nothing interacts in a vacuum. This is very important because it gives you a lot of power that you probably did not realize you had. We've grown up with the common sense theme that oh, your lifestyle matters. You know, diet and exercise, get a good night's rest. It sounds like common sense, but a lot of it's just sort of, all right, well, that seems reasonable, but it's kind of a black box. Like, you really don't know how much your lifestyle, unless you're doing something really extreme, you really don't know how much your lifestyle is actually changing or influencing your genetic programs. But actually, there's a huge influence. So not only do we have the genetic predispositions, but we can actually change the function of our genes based on our lifestyle. That is the power everybody in this room has. Everybody in this room has. So Winifred Langley here is this great example because she's doing something we don't necessarily associate with a healthful lifestyle. She was born and was 7 years old around the time World War I began, and she started smoking at the ripe old age of 7 years because it relaxed her. So it's estimated she's smoking her 170,000th cigarette here. Somehow she has been able to evade all kinds of cancer where the toxins from the cigarette smoke are touching, which would be lungs and mouth and throat. Somehow she's made it this far, and she's celebrating her 100th birthday by doing the thing she likes most. She's lighting up her 170,000th or so cigarette here. So there may be some, I mean, maybe she just won the lottery. You know, maybe she just got really lucky and somehow she just didn't have that right cell turn into a cancer cell or something, and she just got lucky. But she would have had to, I mean, 100 years of age, doing this since you're 7 years old, you know, she would have had to get really lucky. You know, it's kind of like winning the lottery, but winning it again and again every decade, to go on and on and on and not be adversely affected by something that we know has a profound influence on health.
But only the good die young.
Well, she must be really bad. I guess Winnie is really bad then. Really bad.
I don't know if you take the questions here, but
Go for it. Let's have this be open.
aging has increased the average lifespan by about 1 year every 4 years since 1900. So that's like 25 years added to somebody who maybe used to die at 60, 100 years ago. Genes don't change that fast.
Nope.
So
Nope.
in the
Absolutely.
environment and lifestyle is the reason for
Absolutely.
that tremendous growth.
Absolutely.
Lifespan.
So let's look at this a little bit. Let's take a step back and just look at what's happening. Elm's absolutely right. I mean, there's been a huge jump in lifespan. There's been all of this talk about whether or not this can continue at this rate. And if it does, maybe we get an estimate of where it stops by looking at folks like Winnie, who somehow maybe the effects of lifestyle aren't so important for these folks, and they're our indicator for how long we can live and live healthy. And there's a lot of reason to believe. I mean, we have billions of people on the planet right now. We should have lots of different genetic combinations, lots of different lifestyles. So maybe we just look to these people who are living to extreme age and we say, well, you know, whatever their genes are, that must be it. And whatever age they live to, that must be it. That must be it. That must we must be seeing in them our maximum potential. I mean, billions of examples. There's quite a lot of diversity in environment and genetics. Okay, so let's talk just really quickly about what's happened to longevity in the human population. You can imagine back in our hunter-gatherer days, you were lucky if you made it to reproductive age. Okay? There was, if you go back to the middle of the last century, we had huge increases that were probably due to a reduction in infant mortality and illnesses that might take people, again, before they were, possibly before they even made it to reproductive adulthood. But then what accounts then, since we've really reduced all of the early life death, and you know, what has been influencing it, say, in the last 60, 70, 80 years so much? Well, a lot of improvement in lifestyle, a lot of improvement in what we have available to us in the way of medical treatments. But are we coming to the end of that? I mean, how old is the oldest person out there? You know, it seems like people are making it maybe into their 120s or something. There's this guy, though, that I heard recently that might be in his 140s somewhere, and you know, it's possible. We don't have a lot of these examples, which is why some aging researchers have begun to speculate. Maximum human lifespan is 125 years, and maybe we can keep people healthy until that point, but it won't go past that. But they don't know. They absolutely don't know. And some of the genetic tweaks that we have, we wouldn't necessarily see in a person. Because as I'll show, some of the things that might make you live long and healthy now would have caused you never to be born. Because there are trade-offs in nature. This is a recurring theme that I wanted to touch on, these recurring themes in nature. One of them is, of course, has to do with that first goal of life, which is to grow and to reproduce. The other one has to do with being able to adapt to changing conditions. So, you can imagine that there's programs to help you adapt and survive stressful situations. Maybe that's because the conditions weren't good for growth and reproduction. That's why you needed to be able to adapt. Why does Mother Nature care? Why was there any selective pressure? Because you have to live long enough to grow and reproduce. So when the conditions aren't good, what do you do if you're trying to grow and reproduce? You can't grow and reproduce. You try to do that, you'll die. If the conditions are poor, your only other option is to survive long enough for conditions to get better. This theme will come back again and again. So what influences aging? What was our first hint that we might actually be able to do something? I would say we go back to some early studies in mice. We've actually known for 100 years that you could not just decrease life with environment, but that you could significantly increase average lifespan. And by significant, I don't mean 5%, I don't mean 10%, I mean 30, 50%. Just by tweaking diet. And what some early researchers found, very small number now, the scientists were talking, oh, there was an experiment over here that was published. 30 years later, there was another experiment here that was published, where people were seeing that if they just restricted the diet in rodents without causing malnutrition, they made sure they had all their vitamins and minerals, they weren't starving them to death, but they were severely restricted. And there was a couple things that happened. As you might imagine, The animals grew more slowly. It took them longer to become reproductive, and it was harder to reproduce. But they ended up living a lot longer. So that seems so strange, because I know the way that I at least started growing up, and it was a pretty common theme still while I was growing up, that you had to feed yourself. You had to get enough nutrients, right? And you would grow up big and strong, and that makes sense. And we want that, and we want enough nutrients that we can use our brains, and we can be competitive, and we can be aggressive when we need to be aggressive. And that was the major theme, right? Because ever before in all of human history, the point has been to get enough nutrients to survive. It hasn't been like what we've had in the last 40, 50 years, which is, well, now sometimes we have too much nutrients, right? That's the problem now. Sometimes it's not enough of the right ones, but a big theme is we just get too much sometimes. So that too much, all of these things are telling your genes a story. When this came out, when people saw you could get, you could increase lifespan so much, and there's no context to put this in. What does a mouse have to do with a human being? We don't even understand the chemical nature of genes at this point. We don't know anything about anything. So it's interesting, but it's something some scientist is doing in a laboratory. What does it have to do with human health? So we cut forward half a century to some very interesting studies that were done in flies. And this is where when I heard about this, not in the 70s because I was born in the 70s, but when I heard about some experiments that were done in the 70s, this really made me tune in. There was a guy named Michael Rose who was breeding flies, and he was doing some selective breeding where he would take females that could breed later and later in life. And within 20 or 30 generations, he had flies that were living twice as long. 20 or 30 generations is not enough time for evolution to take place. Early when I got into biology, I thought, well, there's reshuffling genes that are there in the gene pool, and based on that reshuffling, that's how they got that effect. There may be some truth to that. I think probably even a greater influence was maybe some selection for epigenetic changes. These are changes that aren't encoded necessarily in the genome, but they're changes in accessibility to certain genes that can be transmitted. If you've ever heard of a guy named Lamarck and Lamarckian evolution, it was nonsense up until we started learning about epigenetics. And, oh, okay, well maybe there's a little something to Lamarck, and the idea is that you actually inherit from your parents, whatever your parents' lifestyle was, whatever their environment was, you inherit something from that. And there's some truth to that. I had no idea, but when I heard about this, I was a meteorologist. This was the late 90s, and I was studying polar meteorology at the Bird Polar Research Center at Ohio State University. And I happened to come home one day and just caught a program on, it was Discovery or Learning Channel or something. And there's two things I remember from this program, because it was like 20 years ago. One was these flies. I remember, oh, by the way, the title of the program was The Genetics of Longevity. So late 90s, talking 1998, I think. I remember flies. I remember that one thing. But the thing that really hit home, that really made me say, this is a game changer, I gotta go change careers, because this is so important, was the discovery that a single gene, just a small change in a single gene, could profoundly extend lifespan. And I don't mean it just made the organism somehow live longer until you scored it as dead. These animals remained young, for all intents and purposes, longer. Really, really remarkable. And for me personally, This was a transformation in my thinking. I did not know why it should work. I just knew the implications. And anybody with a brain can think about what the implications are. That means if that's true in human beings, you might actually have a chance of creating a drug or something. I mean, that's what a lot of drugs do. They can influence the function of our genes, the level of our proteins quite often. That was a game changer. Again, I did not understand why it would work. I just knew what the implication was. And this was really the finding. And it was in this tiny roundworm that we use in the lab called Cinorhabditis elegans, or C. elegans for short. Tiny roundworm, lives in the ground all over the world. Only lives for about 3 weeks. You can imagine, you can figure out what happens to his lifespan really fast, really fast. It grows from an egg to an egg-laying adult in 3 days, 3 to 4 days. So very rapid life cycle, and we can get lots of these buggers too, because they each can have up to 300 progenies. They're hermaphrodites, so they fertilize themselves with their own sperm. Great model and a huge genetic toolbox for us to go investigate things. In the early 90s, there was a scientist named Cynthia Kenyon, and she found there was this gene, DAF2, and it was called DAF based on a characteristic that was associated with it when you mutated the gene. And that had to do with how it grew and how it developed. So they knew this is a gene very important for the program of development, for growth, for reproduction. And so what she found, you could do a small mutation, not kill this gene, not get rid of it, but you could tweak it, change a few things about it. And all of a sudden your worms in your petri dish were living twice as long. They were remaining healthier longer. Really remarkable was how resistant they were to stress. And I'm not just talking about our psychological stress here, I'm talking about physical stress. And there's a lot of stress you don't even know about inside of you. Okay? You might know about the stress of exercise, or the stress associated with being injured someplace, the stress associated with trying a new diet. But at the cellular level, our cells are undergoing stress all the time, and there are periods of stress we just cannot account for. Well, these guys have about 1,000 cells total when they're grown. That's all they have. So we can look at those cells, and there's cells like what we have: muscle cells, intestinal cells, neural cells. And we know that this resistance to stress actually is directly tied to their ability to stay disease-free and alive. We could throw poison, you could throw heat, radiation, you name it, you throw it at this organism, it's way more resistant. It's a super animal. It really is a super animal. And that old adage, you know, nothing is free, you know, no free lunches. But this was pretty cool because it really does appear that, for all intents and purposes, they're what we would call a superhero for a worm. Well, it turned out within a few years, this whole pathway, this whole genetic pathway started to become resolved. And what we knew is that normally this gene, which is involved in development, it gives a signal to the protein encoded by the gene, sits on the surface of the cell. And it's taking cues from the cells around it and other tissues that are floating through. It takes cues from the environment, and it transmits information down to another protein called FOXO. Or in worms, it's called DAF16. Another gene they knew was tied to developmental programs. Okay? Programs. So something is programmed that's influencing aging. That kind of gives rise to the whole idea of programmed aging, even though that might not be quite what it is, but it definitely instills that paradigm. Now this, the function of this is if this is active all the time, it keeps this inactive. But those conditions that keep that top molecule active have to do with conditions that are associated with good times for growing, good times for reproducing. There's plenty of food, it's not too hot, it's good. Conditions are good. If conditions aren't so good, then the activity of this gene goes down. And now it no longer keeps this sequestered. It no longer keeps this silent. And the function of this protein is to go and control a whole group of functionally related genes that have to do with basically those enhanced resistance to stress that I was talking about. So really remarkable. All of this whole lifespan effect was tied to this factor. When you got rid of this factor, the animals lived just fine. But you no longer saw lifespan extension. So you attenuate the function here. This goes in and it turns on all these genes that are important for all those wonderful effects. But you don't get something for nothing. Why is this gene there to begin with? Did Mother Nature care about extending adult lifespan in this worm and making it more resistant to poison, to radiation, to heat, to starvation, to whatever you would throw at it? Did it care? Probably not, because unlike us, these guys really don't have to live past reproductive age. Once they lay their eggs, they don't do any child rearing. The most they do is they try to lay the egg somewhere where there's some food, and then take off and go to lay the next egg, and the next egg, and the next egg. This is the life cycle of the worm. It starts with an egg. Within a few hours, the egg hatches. It goes through several different larval stages, and then it becomes a reproductive adult. When conditions are bad, and by bad, I mean there's not enough food, there's too many other worms around, too much crowding, it's too hot, this animal makes a decision, and it doesn't think about it, it's genetically wired into its programming. Makes a decision at the end of this first hatched larval stage, and it says, do I go on and keep growing, or do I go down an alternative path, and I go into this dour state? The dour state is basically a super long-lived, stress-resistant, non-reproductive state. And all it's there for is to help the animals survive long enough for conditions to get better, just as I said, and then it can move out of that stage and go through normal lifespan and normal reproduction after that. Normal adult lifespan, normal adult reproduction. But I said this whole this part of the life cycle takes 3 or 4 days. The adult lives maybe 3 weeks. They can stay for months in that dour state. It's completely non-aging. That's part of the reason why our aging examples and the examples of how far we can extend lifespan in this animal are so robust, because it really has a very dramatic mechanism for surviving stress. That doesn't mean it's irrelevant for us, because believe it or not, it's tapping into the same stress response programs that we have inside of us. It just happens to have a very extraordinarily remarkable, extreme example of it in its development. But that's the paradigm. You're not reproducing, okay, during this time. So if you go into this state and your buddies don't, and conditions are good, what happens to you from Darwin's point of view? You're not going to get selected for. So yeah, you might be a super worm, you know, in an adult state. You might have some of the characteristics of this dour: super resilience to stress, long life. But you're going to get outcompeted very quickly. So this is the plug now for the research that we're doing here. As I said, that gene, it had to do with development. It is the DAF2 gene. controlled all that aging in the worm. That one is like our insulin receptor, the receptor on the surface of our cells that senses insulin, and also other growth-related factors. So we have some different receptors on our cells that go and they sense, what's going on around the cell for cues about what's happening in the environment or what's happening in the rest of the system. Well, here we're turning down the function of the gene and getting this remarkable lifespan increase. What happens if you turn down the activity of insulin receptor inside of you? You get diabetes. So that's not so good. That's not so good. But if you do that to a growth receptor in a mouse, you get a very different outcome. You don't get a diabetic mouse, you get oftentimes a dwarf mouse. But that dwarf mouse that had a disadvantage, right? It's not able to signal right to grow. It lives twice as long. That's a mammal. Now we're no longer talking about a worm, we're talking about a mammal. Now again, that's pretty good. You don't get something for nothing, right? The good thing is, the worm, the mouse, you can tap into this stuff after you're all done growing, after you're all done reproducing. That's hacking a pretty nice program to increase your ability to resist disease and resist the ravages of aging. So we don't necessarily want to go and attenuate insulin signaling within us. We don't necessarily want to go in and start injecting each other tomorrow with the latest gene therapy because this is far from being perfected right now. But if we have a drug that can simulate these effects, or if we can tap into the processes that the programs affecting aging in that worm or in the mouse, if we can tap into them more directly, maybe we can go straight to this anti-aging source rather than just relying on these sort of top-down approaches where we influence some hormone signaling molecule and just expect all the right outcomes. Well, one of the things we know is that we can increase lifespan with dietary restriction. We know that is completely dependent on genes. And if you do something to the genes that are important for that response, you can get rid of the protective response. You can get an animal that lives a normal lifespan, but you take away its ability to respond to dietary restriction, now it doesn't get a lifespan benefit. It's not just a bag of biochemistry. There are programs that are being influenced. One of the things we see with dietary restriction, and we see this with almost every genetic and environmental manipulation that we do to increase lifespan and increase stress resistance and delay age-related disease, we see protein synthesis affected. Protein synthesis in the cell, or mRNA translation as it's called, is the most expensive thing that happens inside your cells. What do I mean by expensive? It's energy expensive. The chemical energy required is the most expensive, and it requires a lot of raw materials. It has to be exquisitely fine-tuned to your environment and to its environment. And the reason is, for a very long time, we've sort of had this paradigm, this way of thinking that there's these things called transcription factors that affect gene programs. And that's what that FOXO factor I showed you that goes into the nucleus of the cell, that's what that is. And certainly a lot of our cells' responses are directed by transcription factors and the genetic programs that they control. But what's been, for a very long time, sort of overlooked, oh sorry, turn this back on. What's sort of been passed off is the influence of mRNA translation. This is the actual protein synthesis itself. You know, a very basic paradigm of genes, what our genes do, they get copied when they are going to become active. There's a copy of the gene made, and then it goes and there's a machine in the cell that reads the transcript that was the copy, and that is translated. That is protein synthesis, and what it's translated into is the protein. Basically, there is a code for what protein to make. It gets translated. We now realize this is not just a foregone conclusion, that once you copy the information from that gene, that it necessarily gets transmitted into becoming a protein. There are all these different layers of gene regulation that are happening at any given time. And we're now understanding that many of the programs for controlling stress responses, and it's those stress responses that are key for being able to maintain healthy cellular function and organ function, that a lot of the regulation is happening at this stage. And so this is something that our lab is very interested in, and one of the discoveries that we very recently made and published in the journal Aging Cell was that when you turn down protein synthesis, for a long time people thought that just happened to protect the cell from more damage. And that's true. If you are heating a cell, if you put cells in a petri dish or in a liquid culture and you go and heat them beyond what they're comfortable to be at, it's a stressful situation. If you've ever been in in a hot tub or in a sauna, you begin sweating pretty profusely. Well, what the cell does is it begins immediately reorganizing its function. And it says, let me move the emphasis away from synthesizing new proteins. Now, obviously proteins necessary to grow, necessary to reproduce, but let's hunker down and let's just maintain. Let's try to survive this stress. So this process of protein synthesis is actually redirected. It's not just turned down. It gets redirected. So if you're up here, if you're synthesizing a lot of proteins up here, now you go down here because you're trying to remove some of the stress on the system. It also redirects it, and that's what hasn't been a lot of appreciation for until fairly recently. And what we found is that there's another gene program for protecting you that becomes activated under a low translation condition. But it doesn't happen right away. You got to turn down translation for a while. Just like you can imagine you might have to diet for a period of time before you see some positive effect. Before we see a really strong protective effect, we have to turn down translation for a while. And it activates not this guy. This guy's one of the most famous, okay, because of the amazing impact and how it acts across species, this FOXO transcription factor. There's another transcription factor that's equally as famous, but it predates this one. It predates multicellularity, and it's called heat shock factor 1. And that is the thing that we saw turns on when we turn down translation for an extended period of time. That is associated with giving the animal an amazing amount of protection from any environmental stress that comes along. And what's really remarkable is that we can put proteins that are associated with neural toxicity in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. We can put these proteins like alpha-synuclein, beta-amyloid, we can put them in muscle, make them made inside the muscle of the worm. And so instead of getting neurodegeneration as they get older, they become paralyzed. And it's really easy effect for us to see. And so all they can do is kind of move their heads and they can move their tails. Now they grow up just fine. Just like us, it's an age-related effect. Well, what we found is we can turn down translation and protect them, but it's not lower protein synthesis that matters, because we can turn that translation down inside the tissue, inside the muscle, and there's not a protective effect without this gene activation program happening through HSF1. And so it kind of brings everything full circle from changing protein synthesis back to the top of where you begin to regulate gene expression. So we're very excited about moving that forward now and what that means. So that's my little plug for the lab. But the good thing is what I said earlier, which is nature doesn't waste anything. And we have different numbers of genes in common. For C. elegans, this tiny little roundworm, we share about 40% of our genes. If you're this fish, it's 70%. But that's not really true for the types of things we're looking at. For the types of things we're looking at, they are almost 100% conserved. These stress response pathways and the genes involved are almost perfectly conserved because you need them. You need them to adapt. You need them to be able to change function in your cells when it is appropriate to do so. What happens when we get older? We lose the ability to regulate these things. And so what we have found in our research, and other aging researchers have found in theirs, is that we have the ability to preserve the function of these programs much longer than they would on their own, just by tweaking a few things. And as long as you have that ability, that seems to be the key, as long as you have the ability to adapt, you are healthy enough to have some ability to adapt to a new diet, to that time in the steam room, to whatever it is, as long as you can still recover fully from a stressful situation, as long as you can tap into these programs, you have the ability, or as long as you can adapt, you have the ability to tap into these wonderful programs. And like I said, this is preserved from single cell all the way up to us. And the only thing that really changes from a single cell into the multicellular is then you have to take into account hormone signaling in a multicellular animal like us. So we have gene variation, lifestyle influencing genetics. We know it's not in a vacuum. There's a concerted effort here. The fact that we have single genes means there's a possibility for therapeutics. Again, because drugs are often changing the activity of select genes. That's how they work. So, now we get into the more fun stuff. What are the possible anti-aging drugs and supplements? What are the caveats? What are the potential out there? I've mentioned now a few times this dietary restriction. I should say dietary restriction is not just about starving yourself, although oftentimes that is the way that it's performed, is just kind of to do less of the foods that you already eat. What's interesting is that in animals we can change the composition of the nutrients. So we can change the ratio of the fat, of the protein, of the carbohydrate without restricting calories and get lifespan extension. In fact, we can even just restrict one single amino acid, an amino acid that's necessary to begin that process of protein synthesis. Just restricting that one thing in the diet can increase lifespan 30 to 50% in a rodent. So that's pretty amazing, pretty remarkable. And that's a complete absence of less calories. In mice that are fed on an every other day regime, they get those effects through fasting. Every other day fasting. They end up eating on the days they're allowed to eat. They end up eating everything they missed the day before. And they still get the benefit. Why? Because they're tapping into a program in the cells that says, ooh, maybe conditions aren't great. Better hunker down, better make things more efficient, you know? Better clean house. What does your cell do when it's not getting nutrients? It begins to sort of eat itself in healthful ways. Overturns a lot of the proteins and cellular constituents that are around. This process, this kind of gets into this process of hormesis. If you've ever heard You know, you ever heard the old adage, what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger? There's some truth to that. If you have a stress that you can recover from 100%, in a worm, we can give them one little short period in the sauna. And now they're cold-blooded, so they have to go to whatever the temperature is. We give them one treatment, one heat treatment, sublethal, they recover it from it 100%, boom, lifespan increase. That one time they engaged all that stress response machinery and upregulated at one time in their life. Now they live for a fairly short amount of time. So maybe for you, you need to visit the steam room once every 3 weeks to get that effect. I mean, I don't know. But it's definitely worth thinking about. Whenever you exercise, what are you doing? I mean, you're stressing yourself, right? You start to sweat. You create a bunch of oxidative damage. And if you ever heard anything about the free radical theory of aging, that should be terrible. But you also upregulate all those stress response mechanisms. Now, we all know it's possible to do too much. You can exercise too much, and then you're not allowing yourself to recover. But within moderation, you get the positive effect.
But when people are subjected to stresses such as in disease, whether it's physical disease such as a heart attack or something else, or a mental health disease such as depression, that could encourage them to more of that in the future rather than making them stronger. So that
exactly.
That's what you're saying.
And that is an example of chronic stress. So if you work out and you go for a walk half hour a day, or if you try to do aerobic exercise for 12 hours a day, who knows, you might put scar tissue on your heart. I mean, you're going to do damage. So that really is the difference, is there's such a thing as a chronic damage. That will wear you down more quickly than that acute short-term stress that you completely recover from in a short amount of time.
So the principle you're talking about, does that apply to high-intensity interval training and exercise?
I would imagine so. We don't know how all of these things are going to perfectly apply to every dietary regime and every exercise regime, but again, as long as you're following the basic principle that you are able to heal 100%, that you're not overdoing something, or you're not causing a chronic condition with whatever it is that you're doing. That's the real difference, because certainly if we leave these guys in the heater, they're going to die. But you give them a sublethal amount, and they're still healthy enough to fully recover, they actually end up becoming hardier. So it's a very much a recurring theme. So the problem with some of the dietary restriction out there are people who are already experimenting on themselves, as you can imagine. How many diets do we have out there? There's a gazillion, right? So diet's going to be the first thing that people jump to, and it's perfectly understandable. That's what you have control over. So there are people doing chronic dietary restriction, again, without malnutrition, or there's people who are doing these periods of fasting. The problem with the caloric restriction is that you've got some bad side effects. You're cold, sex drive goes down. There's some drawbacks, right? Maybe with a different form of dietary restriction, you can get around some of that. But the real money, the real interest is in, coming up with something that makes it a little easier for us to tap into these things without having to be too radical with our lifestyle changes or having to suffer too much. And so that's where therapeutic drugs come in, like some of them that are mentioned here, which do seem to be tapping into aspects of dietary restriction. These first two in particular, and also resveratrol. And so probably a lot of people have heard of resveratrol because you hear that it's in our red wine. which I had up here. Metformin has been around forever, decades and decades and decades. The diabetes drug for helping to regulate blood glucose. This is one of the closest things that we have that's been around that looks like it might be actually mimicking some of these effects based on energy. Rapamycin, it targets this nutrient sensor that you have inside of your cells, and it tricks it into thinking there's not a lot of nutrients around. Rapamycin, by the way, what's that for? That was designed for being anti-rejection. You get a kidney transplant or something. So they didn't know what these pathways were all about. It's only after the fact, now that we've been studying how aging works, we realize there's drugs out there that influence these pathways that we're interested in. So there's some reverse engineering going on, or basically taking some of the drugs that are already there and maybe repurposing.
What's hormesis?
Hormesis is this idea that you give yourself a little stress that you can recover from.
Sorry,
Yep.
yes,
Yep.
I do.
So metformin, this is a very interesting one. Like I said, a lot of years of research on it. It was now being looked at, it's been tested from worms up through mice and beyond to show that it increases lifespan. Now for the first time we're getting close to testing this in humans. And there have been some researchers who've been working with the FDA to get the first trial of its kind. It's called the TAME trial, where they're going to test metformin in folks, I believe, between 65 and 80 or 85. And what they're looking for is to see if this will stop comorbidities. You know, once you get sick with one thing, there's a chronic stress. And that begins to, there's a lot of evidence now in animals like C. elegans that once you cause a condition in one tissue, it gets exacerbated. And once you increase the function in one tissue, you accentuate the function of exterior tissues. Very interesting. So what they're looking for in the first one is to see, will it stop or slow down comorbidities, the onset of comorbidities. So you get this disease and you get this disease and you get this disease. Will it slow that down? So the only thing that's slowing it up now, because as far as I understand they have the approval from the FDA, is a kind of a money thing. As you can imagine, pharma should be jumping all over this, right? But metformin it's not worth anything. I mean, they can't make any money off it. It's been around so long, all the patents have run out, and it's cheap. I did an interview, a radio interview with a researcher we had for an aging course last summer. It was one of the signature courses on aging that we kicked off at the Institute. And somebody called in and said, how do you know this isn't just going to be used to keep the rich and powerful young forever at the expense of everybody else? You know, it's kind of immediately launched. That's a very, well, how do we know that this is going to be fair? Well, for this one, it's, $5 for a big old bottle of the medication. So there's going to be no exclusivity, at least with regard to that one drug. So that's very, very promising. They're looking about combining these things in mice. I don't know how far the data is, but we want to see, because these things have been tested independently and they're shown to have an effect. And there's kind of a little bit of hope that there might not just be an additive, but possibly a synergistic effect from combining these things. So stay tuned on that. Other things that are sort of coming down the pipe right now, other things that might mimic dietary restriction effect, something called senolytics. If you've heard of senescence, it's sort of where your cells go into a non-replicating state because they've experienced some damage. It was thought for a long time this is just meant to stop cancer as a cancer prevention mechanism. and there's certainly truth to that, I think. But it's also something that's necessary for wound healing. The problem is you begin to build up senescent cells as you get older, and they begin to send little signals of damage out to the rest of your body. And the way they do that is through inflammation, inflammatory signals. And if you probably, a lot of you are aware, chronic inflammation is the enemy. You don't want to be. If you can do things to help avoid inflammation, do it, because that does seem to be one of the major drivers. That's where evidence seems to be stacking up, at least right now. So getting rid of those cells, there's some evidence now where they've genetically gotten rid of senescent cells in mice when they're in, once they're adults. Get rid of them, and then they live longer. So very interesting idea that you might take a drug someday and it kills off your problematic cells. So very interesting. And recently there was I had a colleague I knew at the Buck who now is running a lab in Europe, and he just published a cell paper where they've come up with a way to kill cells basically through drug that are senescent cells. So a lot of really promising, very interesting things coming down, and I've talked a lot, so I want to answer questions that I can. I know some of you have your favorite supplements and you're going to ask me about them, and there's a lot of supplements I don't know about, honestly, because I tend to be focused on the ones that I already know something about in the context of aging. But let me just open it up.
Does dietary restriction work in monkeys?
Does it work in monkeys? So there were some experiments that were set up back in, I think, the 80s to address that. And at first, so a couple of different sites. Some of the evidence was a little bit questionable at first. Some of the evidence coming out now, that it's a little later, is that yes, it does. You can imagine that we've learned a lot about dietary restrictions since the 1980s. And also about the importance of the initial experimental setup. I personally had some questions about how some of those experiments were set up. The problem, that's what we want to know, right? Because we're closer to monkeys than we are to mice. So what happens with the monkeys, the problem is, because we're closer, it also means we have to wait a really long time to get the answer. And you better make darn sure that the experiment was set up right at the beginning. Otherwise, you're not going to be, you're going to have spent millions and millions and millions of your money, taxpayer money, and not get the answer that you're going for. But right now, it does look like that is panning out. We've done it in dogs, and it's so common across such a wide. The response is so preserved across such a wide array of species. There's really no reason to believe that we would not receive some of the benefits. We certainly know that we get the negative aspects of a bad food diet, So, why shouldn't we be able to tap into some of the more helpful aspects?
Yeah, I have two questions. I'll ask the first one, and then maybe if I can get the second. The first one is, I read recently they've been doing blood transfusions from young mice to older mice, and they live longer, look healthy, etc. Yeah. And the reverse, if they take blood transfusion from an old mouse and give it to a young mouse, they age faster. So what's in the blood factors, hormones,
right,
or immune system cells? What's going on?
Yeah. So this is very interesting, because it definitely gives rise to the whole idea of vampirism and living forever, doesn't it? Okay, so these are, it's true. These experiments have been set up where they hook up the circulatory system to a young and an old mouse. They can do that in the mice because you can have genetically identical mice that won't reject each other's blood. So you can hook these animals up, and yes, the older animals become younger. And so obviously there's a lot of interest in what are the factors, and so there's been this factor comes up and somebody else says no, that's not it. We don't know yet. We don't have the answer. There's definitely something to it. Hopefully it will be one or a small number of things that we can simply synthesize and and give to people as needed, that would be really, really fantastic. It definitely does evoke some interesting imagery and ideas. I was a horror movie buff growing up, and so I had these ideas in my head like, oh my God, where are we headed with this technology? But yeah, absolutely, there's a lot to be said for that. So something's going on, something's being transferred across that really does seem to be having an effect.
Jay and I take a pill. It's called TA65, and I've seen it refuted a lot on the web. It's telomerase 65, and it's supposed to extend or the life of the telomeres. It's based on a plant from China called the astragalus plant or astragalus plant. And I just wondered if you had ever come across this in your anti-aging, because it's a nutraceutical. It can't make a lot of claims, but the underlying thing is you will age less quickly. It will protect your telomeres.
And the evidence right now out there suggesting that it helps maintain telomere length.
Yes, yes, exactly.
So this was one of the very first areas of extreme interest for aging, possible aging therapeutics. Was we knew that there was this limit to the number of times that a cell could divide. If it's not a stem cell, then the telomeres at the ends of the chromosomes get shorter and shorter. It's almost like a clock. Every time the cell divides, the telomeres get shorter, and then it gets to a point where if it tried to divide again, it would literally be disaster for your chromosomes, and so the cell would stop. And this was the limit. And maybe this was the limit for lifespan. And there certainly is evidence that in some clones that are made, they can't control, like, you know, when they cloned Dolly, or we had cloned cows when I was at UMass, you couldn't control how, when you did the gene cloning, how much longer or shorter the telomeres were going to be. And so sometimes you actually did have animals that appeared to age faster and they had shorter telomeres, and ones that had longer telomeres that aged more slowly. But you can't just go and force expression of telomerase, which is the enzyme that increases the length of the telomeres at the caps of your chromosomes, because that could lead to transformation or cancer. So if there is something that, if it's directly related to that, it must be hopefully very kind of at a safe level, that it's not going to lead to sort of some kind of rampant cellular proliferation. It is also possible that it's influencing some other aspect that's helping indirectly maintain telomere length and healthy function in the cells.
I think it's about maintenance.
Maintenance, yeah. So that's not such a bad thing. If you can maintain healthy function, that's great. How close am I?
We're quarter after 6.
Oh, we're 6:15, so we've gone a little over. I'm happy to stay and answer more questions if you want to come talk to me, but I know there are people who want to go home and eat. So I'm going to stop here, and I really appreciate your attention, and I'm glad everything worked out tonight.